This is Outside of New York. In-depth discussions with members of the art world who live and work outside of New York. And here's your host, Craig Gould.
Joseph Havel is a world-renowned artist who lives and works in Houston, Texas. In addition to his studio practice, Joseph is director of the Glassell School of Art and its acclaimed Core Residency Program. Originally from Minnesota, he obtained his BFA from the University of Minnesota and his MFA from Penn State. Joseph is best known for his ever-changing body of work, which consists mostly of sculptures, but also drawings. His artwork has been exhibited extensively worldwide, and he is part of the permanent collections of many of the world's top art institutions, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, the Centre Pompidou, the Ministry of Culture in Paris, the Menil Collection, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. He has received numerous awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Louis Comfort Tiffany Fellowship, the Dallas Contemporaries Texas Legend Award, and Texas State Visual Artist of the Year. He is represented by a number of galleries, including Talley Dunn Gallery in Dallas and Hiram Butler Gallery in Houston. I recently sat down with Joseph in a private viewing room at Talley Dunn prior to a recent opening, where we discussed growing up in Minnesota, conceptual art, white shirts, the Glassell School, the state of change in San Francisco, and avoiding boxes.
I find it interesting to do. But I don't know how you actually get in, sign up for it. She would know.
Sure.
I have no freaking clue how.
Right.
And I think it's capped at 40 people or something, because how many people, but I can't imagine there are 40 people who want to follow me around a mall hearing me talk about art.
But it's interesting. It's an interesting location and just an amazing collection.
Yeah, and they've just, since I was last in there, which is probably a year and a half, maybe, they've reinstalled it. And so there are new things which are interesting. And one of the things I find so fascinating about it is how, as the language of art and sort of the spectacle of art, some kinds of work have moved closer to commercial design, to the language of commercial design, and certain kinds of advertising for these shops has moved closer to using the kind of tropes of art. And so at times you'll be in places and it really is like it's the label that makes you go, well, that video for this store is advertising for the store, and this image over here is really a work of art. It's really just the label. There's so little difference between them. I find that kind of fascinating.
No, it is fascinating, and it speaks to how oftentimes art doesn't necessarily make itself with the thought of becoming commercial design, but it winds up influencing design. And you think of like Ed Ruscha, made pieces, and then 10 years later, your advertisements and magazines, obviously reflect that influence. Right?
No, it's true, but I think there's even, I think it started with that, of course, with the Warhols that they have up at the North Park and so forth, since he came out of that graphic design background. And then it went to, but what's happened is the membrane between them. There's been a lot of exchange back and forth. So there's some artwork that really is truly, borrowing the language of design, and it wants the read to be as quickly as you read design. And there's some design that is for, that is commercial, that wants the value of art and therefore is borrowing some of the imagery of art in order to assign a kind of value to it that is connected. It's just interesting, that exchange.
Sure.
I
think it's, especially when you're talking upscale, the more closely aligning yourself with higher end luxury goods, that kind of goes hand in hand with.
I agree, and it's funny because I just was asked by the Menil collection in Houston. They're opening a new drawing center in the fall, and they had bought a group of drawings, but then they came to me and they said, "Well, we want to for." I don't think it's for like fundraising or support. We want to commission you with this high-end design firm, Acris, who's done things with other artists. We want to commission you to design a scarf. They've done one with like Carmen Herrera and with Rodney Graham and with some other artists. And they said, well, would you? I think because they just bought these drawings, they wanted to have something that relate. And they're opening the drawing center. They wanted something that tied in. So you're right. Suddenly, and they were almost a little embarrassed to ask, like, will you design a scarf? But they immediately, of course, said, well, Carmen Herrera and Rodney Graham have. And I'm like, okay, if Carmen Herrera and Rodney Graham have done it, then I probably can do it too, right?
Right.
It's
exactly.
okay.
So Joseph, thank you so much for agreeing to sit down and have a conversation about your work and your life. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Thank you, Craig.
And so your story starts in Minnesota.
I was born in just outside of. Well, I was born in Minneapolis, but I lived in. My parents lived in a small town just outside of Minneapolis, and we moved when I was quite young to Minneapolis. I grew up primarily in Minneapolis and the suburbs around Minneapolis, with some time in Chicago.
Sure. And so your parents, was it an artistic home?
No. My parents didn't really. That wasn't their interest. The fact is, going back to my grandparents, there were on both sides there were some craftsmanship. One was a pattern maker, and also made lamps and things out of wood for out of as his craft. And on the other, that was my mother's side. And on my father's side, there was some. It was more in terms of home crafts and sewing and so forth. Right. So there was some of that. But no, it was completely foreign to them, and it wasn't with any great encouragement that happened. It wasn't. It's funny because my brother's an artist too, and
wow.
My younger brother, and I'm sure that they really were not prepared for two artists in the family.
So at what point did they start worrying about the amount of art that was being produced?
Well, initially, when I was very young, I was a very, very, very shy child, all the way really through college or undergraduate school. And but as a child, they would also, because of various things that were happening in their lives, they'd leave me alone a lot. Not with my father, who was a quality control engineer, would have this graph paper that had on one side was blank and on the other side would have graphs, and he'd just bring home a ream of it and then hand it to me and just entertain yourself. So I would doodle and draw, before kindergarten. When I played in rock bands through high school, and at some point I started to become involved between rock band and art more, and I think that was they probably weren't prepared for that. They tried to be as good about it as they could, but they weren't really prepared, and they were thinking that would be a phase and it would go away.
Right.
So my brother's 4 years younger, and at one point he started to make art in high school, and I was in undergraduate school.
Right.
And my mother, because of the work that I was making, he was making barns and nice nature pictures and so forth, and I was making what I was making. And she said, she came to me one day when I was at home, and she said, "We forbid you to talk to your brother about art. We like what he makes."
We don't need a bad influence.
That's right. So anyway.
Oh my goodness. So in high school, I mean, I've listened to some of your talks, and it sounds like you had a show in high school that was sort of a seminal sort of opportunity creatively.
In high school, I, not really knowing what I was doing, I formed whatever I thought a conceptual art group, sort of Fluxus group called the Ear Brothers. We would, again, I was very shy, so I would plan things and often they would do them. But when I was in high school, one of the, as a graduating senior, we were to do an exhibition, and I posted a schedule of the times that a certain member, the small, short member of the Ear Brothers would be available, and locked him in a display case in the school. And so that was my first exhibition. Was like, I think it was 2 weeks. He had posted hours, and Eric would get locked in the cabinet.
So the conceptual art of Tilda Swinton sleeping in a case was actually a knockoff of this Ear Brothers conceptual piece.
I really didn't know at the time. I mean, I was making movies and I was making these pieces. Oddly, now in connection to work that I've done about white shirts and that was part of the vernacular, but it was sort of all around these acts. And my first show was locking Eric Hessel in a display case, that one of those ones in high school hall they have those glassed-in cases that aren't very deep, that fortunately, and aren't very tall. So Eric just would get in there and kind of sit, and he'd have posted hours for 2 weeks. So.
Wow! And so from there, you went to University of Minnesota.
Yeah, with 1 year in a community college, and then where I had my second show, and then went to the University of Minnesota.
Sure. And from there, it was Penn State, right?
Yeah.
Right. Do we include the University of Chicago on our resume there?
Well, we don't. I mean, I was there briefly because of this award I won which partially it was in economics, and it was a social science award. That was and from that I ended up with in an urban geography class that then did this research at the University of Chicago. So yeah, I spent some time at the University of Chicago. My freshman year, that was when I was still in the community college. So
right,
yeah.
So that's pretty serious economics. University of Chicago. I mean, did that wind up influencing your worldview? As you progressed through, because I mean that is a broadening sort of experience that most art students don't get.
Well, I was always, I have broad interests. So even through high school, it was important for me to read the things that I felt I should read. I know that to my friends at that time, because I was still playing in rock bands, right? And I seemed like some kind of oddity, because of what I was reading and the things I was involved in. And I suppose whatever I thought it meant to be, I don't think I ever used this word, but I suppose whatever I thought impulsively it meant to be an intellectual, I was trying to be, sort of your punk intellectual. So, that was when I was a senior in high school. Also, I ran into the work of John Berryman, who's a poet who influenced a lot of my work for, his work, because he killed himself while I was a senior in high school, but his work influenced my work for quite a while. So,
and so once you graduate from Penn State, how did you choose where to go from there?
Well, my family was not a very wealthy family. I'd paid for